So thanks for that introduction. I am a second-year master's student in the Nutritional Sciences department, and I chose public health in the pathway to complete my dietetics coursework because I'm particularly interested in the role that food plays in the context of daily life and how we can use that to improve the food landscape and increase health equity. So let me know if at any point I pause or cut out, guys. Oops. There we go. Okay. Lately, new pressures have introduced new challenges to individual nutrition in the context of this current pandemic. In addition to the stress and isolation, most of us are actually bombarded with health information from various sources that may or may not be reputable or relevant to us. Grocery shopping and cooking are both time and financial pressures for many people, including students, and this can be especially pertinent now. So today we're going to walk through a completely non-exhaustive list of common food myths. I'm going to share some of my favorite tips and recipes for cooking for one on a budget. And this is my overarching disclaimer that nothing presented today is individual medical advice, and specific needs should be addressed by a qualified healthcare provider with your personal medical history in mind. Okay, so let's start with produce. Contrary to popular belief, the nutritional content of fruits and vegetables is incredibly similar between fresh, canned, and frozen options. There are tons of great reasons to have canned and frozen food on hand, including cost savings, convenience, and incorporating fresh produce into every meal requires way more grocery trips than most of us are willing or able to make, even when we aren't in school and when we aren't living through a pandemic. So the most important consideration in choosing fruits and vegetables is whether you like them, if they fit into your process, and if they fit your lifestyle. For instance, frozen berries are a great option if you like them in cooked or overnight oatmeal. Whoops, just push the button, sorry guys. Okay, backing it up. While on the other hand, fresh apples or oranges tend to last a long time and are lower cost fresh. I think personally, broccoli and cauliflower hold up really well to freezing, while leafy greens or Brussels sprouts, not so much. And then in the event that you do prefer certain vegetables raw, there are a couple easy ways to extend their shelf life. Both carrots or celery will last a while if you store them in water in the fridge sliced as opposed to in open air, where they tend to get a little bit wilty, especially your celery. Which is great if you like them for snacking because the prep work is done ahead of time. And then another tip I like to share is that if you do work with fresh produce, and if you ever like to use vegetable broth for soups or for seasoning grains, you can actually make your own super easily just by saving washed vegetable scraps in the freezer and then boiling them with an onion, straining, and you can even refreeze that broth in an ice cube tray if you plan to use it in smaller quantities like cooking rice, cooking quinoa, and you can just pull the cubes out one at a time, which is really nice. So when we talk about fruit and vegetable choices, the health benefits of buying organic tend to come up. A lot of folks like to follow the environmental working group recommendations when those are financially feasible. So annually, the environmental working group posts a list of the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. So that's the 12 fruits and vegetables that tend to test the highest in pesticide content when they're not organic, and then the 15 that test the lowest, even if they're not organic. Experts agree, though, that we don't really know what the health impacts of small amounts of pesticide residues might do over time. The Environmental Working Group is not an entirely unbiased source of information. And we also have to consider that washing and general processing steps for fruits and veggies actually remove a lot of the pesticide residues that do come up in testing. So as long as you're washing your produce well, anything that you peel, it's really not a major concern if you're buying not organic. And I know a lot of people feel pressure that if they buy produce, it needs to be organic. Food processing has also gained a little bit of a bad reputation, and some of the health messaging that we see online also can go so far as to suggest that it's necessary to completely eliminate processed foods from the diet for health. In general, processed foods do tend to be a bit lower in fiber and can contain a lot of added sugars, but processing doesn't just mean one thing, and there's a wide range in the degree of food processing that can occur. So food processing also can play a really useful role in shelf life, which I think is important to most of us these days when we're trying to make fewer trips to the grocery store and take advantage of what we have around. So one example that I think is pretty misunderstood is white rice. It tends to get a bad reputation compared to brown rice when nutritionally it's actually incredibly similar with the exception of fiber. If you just do an internet search for nutrition of brown versus white rice, the first popular news article that pops up will caution against white rice because it is quote unquote artificially enriched, which just means that some of the vitamins lost in the removal of the bran and the germ layers of the rice have been added back. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. Artificially enriched just means we've added back lost vitamins, which is a great advantage of modern science. There's nothing about enriched magnesium that makes it lower quality than naturally occurring magnesium. And there's also a distinction here between enriched and fortified. So foods are enriched if the vitamins and minerals lost in processing are added back in, but they're fortified if they've been added to a food that did not originally have them. So historically, enriched and fortified foods have played a really important role in combating population level vitamin deficiencies. In the late 90s, in response to a greater understanding of the relationship between folate deficiency early in pregnancy and fetal neural tube defects, a public health intervention started requiring cereal grain manufacturers to add folic acid to products. So you'll see that today. It's important to read individual labels because not all cereals are created equal, but most cereal grains are fortified with folic acid, which is one of those vitamins that many of us tend to not get enough of. Much of the milk that we buy is fortified with vitamin D, although that process is not regulated in the same way. It's interesting if you do want to look into the history of required and optional fortification. I think it's interesting, but maybe not so much. I think iron is also worth mentioning here because it's one of those essential minerals that's really hard to get enough of if you follow a plant-based diet, because our plant sources of iron are actually less bioavailable. So iron that we get from spinach is less well absorbed than iron that we get from meat, for instance. So iron fortification actually also plays a big role in a lot of cereal. That one you have to read individually because it's not across the board, but lots of brand cereals can be the major source of iron in the diet of someone who doesn't eat something like red meat. This is great news because supplementing iron is kind of a bummer. Most people experience some negative GI symptoms when they do have to take an iron supplement. So cereal is an awesome option for that instead. I've also included all of the recipes that I'm going to talk about in a minute are in the presentation notes, so that'll be shared afterwards. And I dropped a link here for some tips for cooking rice perfectly at home, because if you are like me, you need someone to spell it out for you. Okay. Another common food rule we hear is that fat should be universally avoided or limited. There's been a little bit more attention in recent years about good fats, but the popular news doesn't always do a great job of detailing why some fats are good or what roles they play in the diet. The idea that intentionally limiting dietary fat is advantageous for health or for weight loss became pretty prominent in the 1970s in the US. And unsurprisingly, what we saw over time was that lower fat intake led to higher intake of carbs at a population level. So not only do fat-free processed foods tend to be higher in added sugar. I'm sorry, you guys, I keep doing this. But if I remove a major component of my regular diet that contributes to meal satisfaction and fullness, I'm probably going to eat more of something else. So depending on what that something else is, switching from 2% to fat-free milk on my cereal may not actually align with improved nutrition. So generally, fats from plant sources are associated with fewer negative health outcomes than fats from animal sources because plant fats tend to be more unsaturated, while animal fats tend to be more saturated. I think a lot of the time we talk about fat as being either saturated or unsaturated, but most of what we take in is actually a blend. So one predominates. We tend to know if a fat is solid or liquid at room temperature and make a judgment call based on that. But really, most of what we're eating is actually a blend. This definitely doesn't mean that avoiding animal fats altogether is required for health, but it does mean that if you're interested in doing something like tracking your macros and you notice that your fat intake is higher than is recommended, it's not so much of a worry if your major source is almonds and avocado, as opposed to animal sources. Fish is also an important source of omega-3s, which are essential polyunsaturated fatty acids that we need but cannot make. The other fun advantage of adding fat to a meal is that many vitamins are fat soluble, meaning that they're best absorbed when they're taken with dietary fat. So if you like to make a salad with fruits, vegetables, dark leafy greens, all of those A and K vitamins that are fat soluble are going to be better absorbed with an oil-based dressing than something like a fat-free or a lemon juice-based dressing. So in the spirit of incorporating some versatile healthy fats into cooking at home, I wanted to share a few modifications to an at-home pesto recipe that can add some flavor, some richness, and a little bit of nutritional quality. I personally love pesto, but it tends to be on the pricier side, especially if you're looking for one that's made with an extra virgin olive oil instead of other blends of oils. So it's actually really easy to do at home with a food processor or a blender. And there are a couple of substitutions we can make if we like to. Typically, it's going to be pesto, olive oil, Parmesan, and pine nuts with some garlic and salt. But it's actually really easy to replace the basil with spinach or kale or go for a blend of the three if you want to keep the classic flavor, but combine those micronutrient profiles across leafy greens. Pine nuts are also definitely more on the expensive side, but I've made some at-home pesto with cashews, with almonds. You don't even have to do the nut if you're not interested in the nuts or you have an allergy. And you can kind of play around with different amounts of Parmesan, garlic, salt, and same thing as the vegetable broth. If you're using a little bit at a time, you can line an ice cube tray with plastic wrap and freeze small amounts for use in dishes, which is nice for avoiding food waste. So keeping in mind that fat is a useful component in satiety, we can strategically use it to build snacks and meals that are more on the satisfying side. Combining fat or protein with carbs results in a lower and a more prolonged spike in blood glucose following a meal. So most of us have heard of glycemic index here and there, which is really useful on a research scale to compare equal amounts of different carb items, but it's not so useful on an individual basis where we're typically consuming mixed meals and glycemic load is a more accurate measure of our blood glucose response to a mixed meal. So combining macros is going to reduce that glycemic load of a snack. Mixing macros is also a great way to give your snack a little bit more of a punch, which I think is useful advice for breakfast, especially when we have really long blocks of Zoom meetings in the morning. Breakfast is the meal of the day when a lot of us like to lean toward high carb options. I definitely am a huge fan of muffins, a muffin in the morning, but then I find that I'm really hungry before lunchtime, especially if I have a long block of snacks. So intentionally adding fat or protein can be a little bit of a hack there. So one way to do that, if you like pancakes and if you're cooking for yourself at home, so you don't want to make an entire batch, is to go the banana pancake route, but add a couple of extra ingredients. So they're pretty customizable. They're friendly for cooking for one, and they do freeze well. I like to add quick oats for fiber, chocolate chips, obviously, because that's a necessity. And then a good way to add a little bit more protein, fiber, and plant-based fat is to do a little bit of ground flax. Flax is one of the only plant-based sources of omega-3s that we typically get from fish. And just as a side note, sometimes when you're at Trader Joe's, you're walking down the aisles and you see that advertisement for flax and omega-3s on a box of crackers. And if that box of crackers has whole flax seeds in there, we're not getting any of the omega-3s. You're getting some fiber and there's nothing wrong with them. But because we can't digest the seed coat, it's not a source of omega-3s if it's whole. So what I like to do is buy the whole flax seeds and grind them myself. You can even grind them in a little coffee grinder if you have one of those, or a food processor. Add it to baked goods and add a little bit more fiber and healthy fat in there. There is some suggestion that buying pre-ground flax can result in some oxidization of the omega-3s, in which case they're just not doing you any good. And I think it's cheaper to buy them whole too. So I usually just buy them whole and grind them in my coffee grinder. So on that subject, a lot of folks also have questions about if they should be taking a supplement, and if so, what kind. The reality is that most of us get most of the vitamins and minerals that we need from food, and food sources are usually more affordable and more enjoyable than taking a supplement. Supplements are also not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which means that unlike foods, most brands are not being monitored for content or quality unless there's a documented issue. That being said, there are lots of reasons to include specific supplements in the routine. It might be specific to your health needs, and some brands participate in pretty transparent third-party testing as consumers, so we do have some tools to evaluate what we're buying. A good rule of thumb is to look for the USP symbol on the bottle that shows that they have transparently engaged in some kind of third-party testing, and that tells us that what's in the bottle is what's on the bottle. So you're taking the item that it says, and you're taking the amount that it claims is in each dose. Okay. And then we can dive into some of the more fun and useful tips. So I think there are a couple of items that most of us like to keep in our pantry year-round. If we run out of time, if we just need to sort of put together some separate meal components that we can add later. So a couple of my favorites are quinoa and lentils, because I think they can be really versatile for soups or chili, or even just a hearty protein-rich base for veggies or meat or fish. Some people avoid both quinoa and lentils because of digestive discomfort, which is actually pretty common and can, unless there's a true allergy, can be solved by soaking them overnight in the fridge first. This is definitely something for me with lentils, where I can't even tolerate a canned lentil soup. But if I soak lentils overnight before I cook them, they cook faster. They tend to have vitamins that are more bioavailable because we've broken down some of the insoluble fibers, and we're good to go. It also reduces phytates in grains like quinoa and lentils, which also interfere with vitamin and mineral absorption. One recipe I love to use with protein-rich grains is stuffed peppers, because they can be made on a stove or a hot plate and using an oven or a toaster oven. I lived for 3 years as a real adult with a toaster oven and a hot plate, and I survived. So anyone can do it. They're also really customizable if you have roommates with different preferences, or if you like to reuse the same meal components for new recipe variations throughout the week. So I like to do a little quinoa, some mixed vegetables, maybe have some feta or whatever cheese I like, and then do a fried egg on top. And then later in the week, use those same ingredients to do nacho toppings or burrito bowls, or add them to an omelet, just to sort of stretch things longer, save some time, but also introduce some variety. If you are tired of rotating through the same old grains, if you feel like you're eating rice all the time, I always like to recommend farro, barley, or buckwheat, which I think are some kind of underdogs, slightly less common, that actually can introduce a lot of texture and flavor variety, especially if you want to cook them in a vegetable or a chicken broth. Canned chickpeas are also a great ready-to-go shelf-stable protein that I like to keep around. I think they're great in pasta or on a salad, but they can also be used to make your own hummus at home, which is another save a little bit of money, make a smaller batch kind of hack. I like hummus as a veggie dip or as a sandwich topping, and it adds both protein and plant-based fat to a meal. And there's a hummus recipe in the notes here too. And then this is where I also have to plug my favorite recipe for black bean burgers. I can't take credit. I found them on Sally's Baking Addiction, but they're awesome. She recommends incorporating breadcrumbs and grilling with some Swiss cheese and pineapple. I've even gone so far as to put ground flax in them, to do some feta. I've done pine nuts or other crushed nuts in there. I promise I fed them both to my boyfriend and my mother, and neither of them could tell there was flax. So it's a great high flavor item to sneak a couple extra ingredients into. And I'll say they hold together really well cooked in a pan with oil, but if you want to do the toaster oven or the grill, just make sure to use foil, because anytime we're dealing with legumes in a patty, they don't stay together unless we really cook the outside. I would be neglectful though if I didn't talk about a dessert recipe that can be easily made at home for one. So as we move into cooler weather, we're spending more time inside, and we should definitely have ingredients around for mug cake, which is a classic spur of the moment treat. It can be done with banana or canned sweet potato or pumpkin if you want to play around with the consistency and the micronutrient profile, but I've included recipes for both a regular mug cake and a banana or sweet potato mug cake in the notes. So in general, I just want to say part of the reason that I decided to come back to school to become a registered dietitian is because I'm interested in contributing to this culture of accurate and useful health messaging that empowers people to make educated choices rather than vilifying foods or using shame to help people make behavior changes. I think food's role in our lives is a lot more complicated than simply fuel for energy. And at the end of the day, enjoyment is a valid reason to choose any particular food. I do want to drop a few empowering food podcast recommendations if you're interested in these topics. If you like diet myths and if you're interested in food peace, the Food Heaven podcast and the Food Psych podcast both cover a wide range of topics related to food's role in health and how diet messaging interacts with our lives. They are both hosted by registered dietitians. And then we're also all living in this unprecedented time when it comes to mental health, financial stability, and accessing the resources we need to be successful as students and people. So eating disorder resources are available locally and nationally, and the first step is as small as a text message. While the university and the wider Ann Arbor community also has resources for emergency and long-term food access. The Maize and Blue Cupboard is right here on campus, and Food Gatherers also serves all of Washtenaw County, including students and their families. So thank you for joining me today. I tried to keep it a little bit short. Recipes are all in the notes, and I'm happy to answer any questions.